To start, my name is Ann Lee. I am a managing director at the city's Economic Development Corporation. And from the looks of it, it looks like this has been an amazing day. And I'd like to poll the audience a little bit just to make sure that our conversation tonight is relevant to you. If you consider yourself to be a technical data person, can you raise your hand? Because we prepare some non-tech questions, and I just want to make sure that we're not talking about something that everybody already know. Okay, so this is a pretty technical crowd. All right, so this is the program for tonight. I'm going to do a round of introduction for our panelists. We have really a stellar panel tonight. And then the plan is to do kind of 45 minutes-ish of panel conversation. We'll keep it flexible as to how long that piece runs. And I think the panelists have all been very generous with their time and have agreed to stay afterwards so that there's more one-on-one connection with everyone towards the end. We'll also do an open Q&A in case there are any questions from the audience. So let me start off with the introductions. Ladies first, Maria Gotch. Maria is the president and CEO at the Partnership for New York City Fund. At the Partnership Fund, Maria is working at the intersection of demand for big data products at enterprise scale with supply from entrepreneurial sector. Prior to joining the Partnership Fund in 1999, Maria worked at BT Wolfson, now part of Deutsche Bank, LaSalle Partners, Merrill Lynch Capital Markets in New York City and London. And then next I have on my list Ramnik Gupta. Ramnik is a managing director at Citi Ventures. Ramnik joined Citi Ventures in 2011 to lead the strategic investing and incubation activities that will contribute towards Citi's goal of being the world's leading digital bank. Big data is one of the 5 investment themes at Citi Venture. Ramnik also co-head a partnership with Citi's chief data officer to help bring big data infrastructure stack into the bank. As part of the partnership, Ramnik has been focused on identifying and evaluating emerging technology companies and startups that are innovating in a big data stack space, while the CDO focuses on building the internal platforms to make big data technologies usable and accessible. Prior to joining Citi, he was a partner at Battery Venture, where he worked closely with portfolio companies including Groupon. Larry Lerner. Larry, at the end of the table, Larry is a managing director at Accenture Analytics and a member of the group's global leadership team. Larry has extensive experience in financial services and analytics and returned to Accenture in 2012 after holding leadership roles in banking, payments, and capital markets enterprises. Prior to joining Accenture, Larry was a senior managing director and head of analytics advisory services at Cognilytics, a leading global provider of distributed computing technology, predictive analytics, big data, and business intelligence solution. Previously, Larry was with Capital One's U.S. Card Division, Diamond Management and Technology Consulting's financial services practice, as well as an executive at Citadel Investment Group. Matt Harris. Right next to me, Matt joined Bain Capital Ventures in 2012 to lead the New York City office and to focus on business services companies with a particular interest in financial services. As an investor in early and growth stage financial services companies, understanding and evaluating the data strategies of his portfolio companies and potential investments is a significant part of Matt's work. Most recently, Matt co-founded and ran Village Ventures, where he focused on the same sectors and invested in such companies as Blue Tarp, Consumer United, iSend, On Deck Capital, Simple, and others. Earlier in his career, Matt worked at Bain Capital in the private equity group, and this last bit of bio I personally find to be fascinating and love. Matt is obsessed with military history, and someday will write a book connecting the strategy and tactics of insurgency with what he has learned about entrepreneurship. And Matt Turk. Matt Turk is the managing director at Bloomberg Ventures, the incubation and investment arm of Bloomberg LP. Prior to joining Bloomberg Venture as a principal in 2008, Matt was a senior director at Oracle, where he focused on global new product launches in the search, e-discovery, and collaboration spaces. Matt joined Oracle in 2005 as a result of the acquisition of TripHop Technologies, a venture-backed enterprise software company that he co-founded and where he served as president and COO. Matt started his career as an M&A and securities lawyer at Sullivan Cromwell in New York. So I hope I did not miss anyone. So thank you for all being here tonight. Let me start. So the topic for tonight's panel is around data innovation in the finance space. So let me start by asking the panelists, what are some of the interesting things that you have seen in the data innovation space in financial services? So an example of something you've seen recently where you went, wow, that's really cool. We'll start with Matt.
I think the early innovations in financial services remain on the capital markets side, which is a little bit less of a wow, that's cool kind of space, but it's more of a wow, that made a lot of money for a lot of people kind of thing. So what we're seeing now has a little bit more wow factor, at least from my perspective, and probably the most interesting area for me is the underwriting space. You look at both consumer credit, an area where I spend a lot of time, small business credit. Historically, most of that work has been based on a FICO score. But I think there's a new realization, becoming a mainstream realization, that there's a lot more data available about consumers and very robust data about small businesses. People talk about the data emanating from social media, and I guess if you think about that in its broadest sense, that does capture most of the thrust of it. So when I see the kind of credit performance that's coming out of some of these alternative lending companies in the small business and consumer space, based on harnessing these new forms of data, I think that's a wow for me.
The most interesting things that I've seen, at Citi and at other financial institutions is obviously led by fraud. We are sort of almost always focused on managing and minimizing fraud, and some of the interesting things that come out when you go more and more granular on the data that's available today are pretty interesting. The ability to look for internal fraud, external fraud, compliance, AML kind of things across flows that are global is something that is a pretty powerful big data problem, and we're increasingly being able to leverage all of the information that we had, but we just couldn't do anything with it in the past. But with big data stack and the tools that come with that, we're starting to sort of build better capabilities around that. So that's been pretty interesting to watch.
Maria?
So I'm going to answer the question, since we're at a big data conference with data. Recently saw a study that was done by IBM and Oxford University. They surveyed 1,100 businesses, and they asked for, in 95 countries, a range of different sectors. And they asked them, so where are you in the incorporation of big data into your businesses and your processes? And the answers that came back for all the buzz and all the talk about big data were very interesting. Only 6% of the 1,100 businesses have deployed 2 or more big data analytics tools within their organization. And 71%, so almost 3/4, are still gathering information and developing their strategy. So why that was very interesting is it says for all the talk and all the kind of buzz around big data, having that move into the enterprise level and into the corporate level, we're still in the very early days. And so for a sort of a panel around innovation, I think that's a very interesting statistic that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And of those that are still gathering, some are doing piloting, implementation, some are doing planning, but there's still a lot of people who still have to make a lot of decisions around big data. And I think that opens kind of the potential for some very interesting opportunities.
So what cool companies have found? So a little bit, I think Matt mentioned some of those. So to just build upon his point a little bit, this one company that I particularly like, lots of other people particularly like, in Europe, it's called Wonga. which is one of the sort of alternative lenders. But just to give you a sense of why it's a data play, so they focus, and it's a bit of a controversial company as well, but what they do is they focus on a category of people that typically cannot borrow money at all, or at rates which are not the ones they would want, and they, instead of using a score, they do all sorts of analysis, so they a little bit cagey about how they do that, but that ranges from social media to other things, and they decide whether they're going to want to lend to those people based on that analysis, which is all sorts of different signals, and that's a type of lending which would not have been possible before, big data tools and all these new forms of data existed. And that's a company that's arguably the fastest growing company in Europe, looking at IPO, which is probably going to be valuing it at multiple billions of dollars. So that is, again, that's controversial because what they end up doing is lending to those people at rates which are very high. So that's one example. Another example that I think is very cool because of what it means for us, because we all create all those very large amounts of data, right, with our phones and everything we do. But you could argue that others benefit from the data that we create. So there's some plays in financial services, so I'm thinking specifically of insurance, which are interesting in that they give you the power to use your data to get better rates or to do interesting things. So for example, there is companies in the telemetry space, a company called MileSense specifically, that essentially, you download an app on your phone and you drive, and the iPhone app is going to record what kind of driver you are. Each time you make a left, each time you make a right, it's going to capture it, how fast you turn, and overall how good a driver you are. And if you are happy to do that, then you can essentially get better insurance rates. So I think it's interesting in that big data should empower all of us at the end of the day.
All right, so you guys took all the good examples. So I'll give you a slightly different answer, which is so we've talked about all the great capabilities that big data is allowing companies to leverage. And so I'll hit it from the technology versus the technique, which is when you marry all of those great ideas in terms of collecting data from multiple sources to make either risk-based decisions or marketing-based decisions, then the question is, well, how quickly you can make those decisions or how you can speed up the process to do it so that you can be more relevant when either customers need the information or before the risk event happens. And the two areas where I've seen some pretty interesting results, one of them is in the sort of sub-second fraud scoring space in payment transactions, where instead of using rules-based models, we're beginning to utilize more machine learning adaptive models, so that as the fraudsters evolve in terms of how they attack institutions, the models themselves adapt their scoring and provide real-time sub-second scores and answers so that you can capture a transaction before it gets authorized and really enable a much different process of fraud detection. So I think that technology that enables real-time decision-making in sort of the sub-second space, I mean, I think that's really cool and innovative. And then the other one that I thought that I saw recently was, and I believe it was an insurance company in Kenya, out of all places, how they're utilizing weather data to better underwrite catastrophic losses, and they're I think they were, in my recollection, the first insurance company that, I guess they're insuring a lot of the local farmers' crops And the weather patterns are such that in utilizing this unstructured external data source, they're able to much better underwrite and risk score catastrophic risk that otherwise would have been sort of, fairly flat. And I thought that was pretty innovative.
So I want to follow up on a point that Maria made, which is that most companies are pretty early in figuring out what their big data strategy should be, or how to leverage that information to really find the right application and have transformative impact. What do you think is preventing that process from moving forward? Or maybe put another way, what do you think should happen, or what needs to happen to accelerate that process?
So I'll speak from a little bit of experience here, just working on this effort at Citi. Financial services data and the space is, from the outside, when I was not at Citi, I would sort of look at Citi and say, or any large bank, and say, why are they so slow? Right? Now when I'm inside, I'm just amazed at the kind of things we have to ensure and take care of before we even get to the point of actually extracting any insights out of data. Before anybody can even touch the data, there are massive, massive regulatory hurdles on the data that we have. If you're a global bank, there are massive country-based issues, so you can't move information from one country to another, it can't cross certain boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. There are, this is one of the most sensitive information after healthcare, right? So there is lots of PII type issues there. So all of this requires a very, shall we say, careful approach to building out the infrastructure that knows or allows you to do a certain set of things based on what is allowed from a compliance perspective, et cetera, and provides you access accordingly. So one example, analysts who have access to all this information, Citi moves a quarter of the world's money every day, actually. $4 to $6 trillion move on our rails every day. Now, people who have access to this kind of information can actually, it didn't occur to me, but actually they could trade on that information. So we have to build connectivity with the insider trading systems first before we can allow anybody to even touch the information that we have. So there is a lot of stuff that needs to be built out before we can even get to the point of touching the data and extracting insights out of it, which is something very specific to financial services industry being a regulated industry. And that, in some ways, is certainly slowing things down, in addition to all the other issues around, scarcity of talent, stacks that are just evolving and very early in their life cycle, et cetera, et cetera.
So on that point, I think this issue of access is really a critical one for a small company, and it's a little bit less so in the enterprise area, but as you all know, it's cheaper now to start a company, and it's cheaper to get one going than it was, say, 5-10 years ago. But it still costs the same amount of money to get into the customer base, and still the same amount of time and effort to sort of find the right person to talk to, get them to pay attention to you, get them to give you the feedback that you need to move your product forward. We've developed a model with actually a couple people here on the panel, specifically geared towards financial services and trying to solve that pain point of early stage companies and growth companies trying to get into a big regulated entity like Citigroup. And it's called the FinTech Innovation Lab. And I'm going to do a little commercial because we're going to open applications on November 1st. But we've pulled together 12 of the major banks in town. This year we're adding an insurance company. And for a 12-week period, these institutions are at the table working with early stage and growth stage companies to give them feedback on their product. And the difference between those of you who go into a sales meeting, what happens in these meetings is, I'm sure you've had this experience, you go into a meeting, you pitch your product, they nod their heads politely, they say thank you very much, very interesting, we'll get back to you. What happens in the meetings in this lab, because it's a mentoring relationship as opposed to a sales relationship, is the feedback is, you know what, that's really interesting, but you don't have the firewalls in place, or it has to sit behind our firewall and you need to do this to do that. Or you want to solve this problem, interesting but not critical to us. But if your technology can solve this problem, then we're going to take a closer look. So there's no question it's a big pain point, because then they got to go talk to you. But we're hoping that, and we're doing this because we're trying to leverage the fact that so many of these big customers that are eventually going to be incorporating this technology are in New York City, and just Accenture is our partner in this program.
And I'll just build on what you just said. At Citi, what we've tried to do is, while we are building all of these infrastructure capabilities, we're trying to also create a conduit through Citi Ventures, where we are partnered with our chief data office, etc., to help find new capabilities. Our belief at Citi is that given how early the stack is, majority of the innovation and capabilities will come from startups, and therefore we need to be very, very open to working with and looking at these startups. And what we've done in partnership with our internal businesses is be that first port of call, find the right companies, and then help them come into Citi. And that's essentially the reason why Citi Ventures exists. And so that's another way we were trying to help out in this space.
So, in a similar point, but from a slightly different angle, what we've found in especially the large, complex global financial services companies is, yes, not only is there the regulatory and sort of procedural hurdles that you have to cross, but most of the data lives in multiple silos. And you guys know what I'm talking about in terms of how difficult it is to actually unify either a single view of a customer or a single view of a household. And what we find is that, we probably spend more time, for all you techies out there, sort of on the data layer today than we would like. But that's because that's where the biggest pain points are. We can implement and execute on a number of great, interesting, platforms for analytics, but we still find that among the leading financial institutions, getting to the right data, what we call so that single version of the truth is still very difficult and quite surprising, given what you read about some of these firms in the media. So, we are keenly aware of again talking about new ventures of companies that are really helping to bridge that gap, where you don't require the 3 to 5 year enterprise data transformation program, but rather you can start integrating some new innovative technologies to bring the data together faster and more effectively. And again, that's I think another area of huge interest, not only for us as a service provider, but also that we see among most of our Fortune 500 type clients.
I think so we've heard a lot about how hard it is and, by implication, how expensive it is. But I think the other reason for the delay, not to be negative, but there's also a question mark about the return. So, empirically it's expensive, and empirically it's hard and risky and takes a lot of time. So you're not going to do it, or you're not going to do it quickly unless there's a really crisp, obvious, predictable, and reliable return on it. And I don't think that's true. I mean, it's interesting that fraud is the use case. Because so fraud, you have this $1 billion number plus around fraud cost. Bringing that down is really useful. So that's a great place to spend money on data. But when you think about some other things like cross-selling would be another data use case in a bank, that's pretty speculative. Theoretically, if you knew more about your customers, you could sell them more stuff. But are you going to spend $400 million to know more about your customers? You'd have to sell them a lot of more stuff, in a reasonable time frame. And there may be some reasons they're not buying the rest of your stuff, and it may not have anything to do with data. So I think that up against that daunting expense and complexity is insufficient, obvious, and predictable return. And that's why, the numbers that Maria cited, I think everyone knows it's exciting, but until someone can make a really obvious and clear use case with a clear ROI, there's a lot of inertia.
Matt?
I'll just make quickly the perhaps obvious point that, I mean, we've spoken about large financial companies and how the process is slower. There's a subsegment of the financial industry, specifically hedge funds, which tends to be, not all of them, but a significant number of them tend to be exactly on the opposite and be in the earliest possible adopter or just about anything of the smallest possible startup. I've seen this very recently in a couple of cases where 3-person shop developing some kind of technology or some kind of new forms of data that could maybe provide an advantage to people in those hedge funds. And I have no idea how they fund them, but 2-3 large hedge funds actually reach out to those people. So for certain types of product, those guys can be early adopters and aggressive adopters.
I want to ask about the potential impact for big data, and the question is applicable both to within financial services, and I think we can expand it beyond financial services as well, which is, do you think this big data revolution or evolution is disruptive? Do you think is it in support of things that are already happening, like better fraud detection, better cross-sell, better customer segmentation? Or do you think this can open up completely new doors and has the potential to be a disruptive technology that can completely change the way financial services, consumer market, or consumer finance or capital markets function today? So kind of asking a panelist to put a futuristic hat on.
I'll stake out one end of the spectrum just to make it interesting. I'll go with evolutionary and non-disruptive. I mean, in the 90s, well, before the internet, when you were in venture capital, it used to either be healthcare or information technology. And so to remind us that even 20 years ago, all we were doing when we talked about computers was information technology. This data question, I guess we've now put big next to it, but it has been the consuming, driving force for computers since their start. So I think we're approaching some really interesting levels and scale and volume and real-time nature of data analytics, but I think it's evolutionary. These costs are coming down and sensor deployment is increasing, so the amount and frequency of data is increasing and our ability to understand it clearly increasing. And I think that will allow many more questions to be asked and answered than have been historically true. But I see those curves not as sort of arching exponentially. I think it's a continuing march. As we hit certain interesting levels, you may see minor disruptions, but I would side with more evolutionary than revolutionary.
So just to keep it interesting, I'll take the absolute opposite side. I think a few things are coming together that's making this, probably revolutionary in the future. And my belief there is, these are sort of waves that gather, and at a certain point, the first phase of this wave is usually basic technology creation. Costs, if I was just looking at these numbers, if you were doing cloud storage or computing with Loud Cloud in 2000, and today if you do that with Amazon Web Services, the delta is on an average 100x. That's 2 orders of magnitude in under 10 years, right? Same thing goes with servers that are coming out that I've actually had the chance to look at because of a battery company in the past. Servers that are this big, and 1,000 of them can sit in a rack that used to have probably 100. And this is coming. This is Q1 2013. HP is about to launch something. So when you look at these sort of underlying base technologies, I feel like that's the first enabling phase. The second part of that sort of wave gathering is the infrastructure or the platforms or the capabilities that make these innovations usable by a broad group of people. And that is where, in my mind, the sort of non-linearity comes in. So it's the same sort of analogy as, phones have always been there. People wrote apps sort of before Apple showed up, right? And then there was Apple, they defined whatever the App Store ecosystem was, and all of a sudden you have 1.5 million apps, right? Before that you had 300 with Verizon and 300 with somebody else or whatever it was. So that capability of making it accessible to a very large group of people is where all the work is today. And once that sort of comes in place, my belief is that's when you end up in the third phase of this evolution, which is the nonlinearity part, which is people developing all sorts of applications that you've never even thought of. So I take just the opposite view in the sense that I feel like we're very much in the middle of this sort of three-phase evolution. And if we are able to build these platforms that make this more and more accessible, I think there could be a very non-linear sort of...
If we could just keep going back and forth for a second. So, but what are the business problems, the like screaming business problems that this would solve so dramatically that you could call it transformative, revolutionary, non-linear? Like lowering fraud, I get it.
No,
but
absolutely. So this is where I don't even know because I haven't even imagined those, right? So I'll give you one example. Let's take, I saw IBM sort of this ad the other day where a bunch of machines are just walking, coming down the road on the way to getting themselves repaired because of a bunch of data that was being looked at, and they determined that there's something about to happen to them, and they're sort of preemptively going in there to get themselves repaired.
And they learned how to walk.
that has nothing to do with big data, but the point being, I think these sort of capabilities, start to become possible when all of this data is available for you to do things with. So if you can mash two random sets of data, and the other day I was sort of reading something about Target who figured out that one of their customers, teenage customers, was pregnant before the family knew about it. And all of this was based on a bunch of data that they had and bunch of sort of information that they were able to process to say this is, and they got predictive about what is going to happen, and imagine the models that could get built on top of that. So my sense is, if you have the ability to be predictive, as somebody said, content is king, but data is God, because it allows you to be predictive a little bit. And if you can be predictive, the kind of application that you can build could be pretty innovative.
So, just because I'm a peacemaker, I'll take the middle position. I think I think you guys are both right. So I think it's revolutionary in many ways and for many industries. I think there's something specific to financial services, though, especially market finance, in that it's been a big data industry for a very long time. I work with Bloomberg processes billions of ticks, movements in share prices a day, and it's built an infrastructure, in the 80s to support that. And there's been an army of quants in hedge funds trying to optimize trading strategies or imagine trading strategy based on that for many, many, many years. So I don't think that, having Hadoop or, any better technology real time is going to create a revolution in finance, at least market finance. So it's going to be more evolutionary. But for the rest of the other industries, then there's some very exciting stuff happening. Yes.
So I'll pick up on that point. I think where it is pretty unassailably people agree, going to be disruptive is in healthcare, because for the first time you're going to have information about the treatment of patients, healthcare that's going to be digital as opposed to on paper. And the world of the providers is just at the beginning of getting that information kind of on their electronic health records. That has to finish, and then you have to take the information from the health records and design the tools to analyze that. But, and I won't take credit for this thought, but it was actually David Brailer who was the one who kind of sort of was the impetus for getting a lot of the federal money out to the providers to buy, to incorporate electronic health records. And he said, and I think he's absolutely right, that the innovations in medicine over the next 10 years are not going to come from new drugs or the pharmaceutical company. They're going to come from harnessing this data, understanding which drugs work, understanding interactions, and really dramatically changing how patient care is delivered and probably the cost of how patient care is delivered. And so from kind of a macro perspective in terms of what's eating up a big chunk of our national economy, it's healthcare. And so the ability of big data to go after that problem, to reduce it, help control it, and then while at the same time delivering more effective care, I think is a very interesting, kind of groundbreaking, earth-shattering move.
Larry, do you want to have the last word on this one?
Well, just to build back on the financial services, I tend to agree with the middle of the road, which is it's certainly revolutionary today and will be for the next few years as it becomes table stakes. But there's going to come a point in which if you're not utilizing new techniques to do customer segmentation, if you're not figuring out how to best optimize your data, in the long run, you're not going to survive. So all of these new revolutionary capabilities that are being deployed, in 5 years' time will become table stakes. And I'm going back to, my days in the credit card industry where, you went from an environment that was largely manual, for manual underwriting that went completely non-manual. And that became table stakes for most companies that wanted to really reach out to the masses. 5-10 years from now, not only is it going to be non-manual, but it's going to be incorporating all kinds of new behavioral markers, above and beyond your ability to pay back your loans, that are going to enable those companies that are continuing to move forward to to better split risk and better assess and manage their portfolio. So I do believe that it's evolutionary and ultimately become sort of table stakes for the next revolution.
So the last question, I'm going to ask the panelists to give a word of advice to people in the audience. So we have two types of people in the audience. We have entrepreneurs who are starting companies, who are starting data or companies that have a very heavy data component to it. We have people who are working in fairly large existing corporations who are trying to develop a data strategy for their company. So you can pick one of the two, a word of advice as to how they can better succeed in their daily work when it as it relates to data.
Well, I think Ramneek was exactly right when he framed up where we are in the evolution of this. Note I said evolution of this, which is to say we're in the infrastructure phase. So if you look at what's getting funded by venture capitalists now, it's not the application companies per se. There are some, but relatively rare. It's really the infrastructure players who are building out the stack, because that's the phase where the large customers are. So I think as you think about your strategy, not that any of those layers is anything other than competitive, but that's what's being purchased. So don't skip ahead to the phase where you assume infrastructure's in place and you're selling an application. Remember that most of the large companies, ones where you're trying to steer the strategy or you're trying to get them as a customer, don't have the capabilities in place to take advantage of applications yet. So I think that's point one. Point two was mentioned, I think, by Larry, which is that if there are ways to bring the ROI to the table with more of kind of a warehousing play rather than an inline data play, or if you can get data quickly, perform your magic on it, and deliver results quickly, the more you can steer towards that. If you are bound and determined to be selling applications, it's got to be working on data that's been removed in sort of an offline way, and you can sort of work on it. Because if you're selling an application that's working on sort of inline transaction data, I think we're, for most institutions, many years away from when they can see value in what you're trying to bring to the table.
I'll just build upon what Matt just said. I think if you're sort of building on the infrastructure side, which is where the world is today, just getting a sense for, on the ROI side, which are the key problems and how quickly you can get from installation to money is a very good exercise to go through. And in the banking and financial services world, the fastest way to do that is trading. Right? You have an insight, you develop an algorithm, and you're making millions of dollars through that very, very quickly. So typically, the fastest place to convert data and insight into money is trading. The next is fraud. So protecting transactions, protecting data, protecting against fraud is the second easiest way to make money by not losing money, and that helps tremendously in terms of getting the shall we say the the speed to which you will see yourself deployed at some of these places is very high if you attack these 2-3 problems first. And then there are sort of the broader problems like, as I mentioned, we move a quarter of the world's money every day, which means we should know a lot more about what's happening with the macroeconomy before most others. But this data is sitting in all around the kind of world. It's not easy to work with, et cetera, et cetera. But if somebody could do that, imagine the value of macroeconomic indicators that sits within this data set, right? Or data sets. What's that?
I don't know the guy who did that.
So we should chat about that. But so that to me that's a next sort of order or next level of difficulty of the problem. And then there are sort of the marketing sort of new revenue generation type of problem sets to go after, which is the sort of 360-degree view of the customer to do better recommendation, upsell, things like that. Again. The techniques that people have are pretty well developed. So to make or to show a difference or change takes a lot of effort in those areas. So it's just a question of, if you want to see yourself working with one of these companies, just understanding where are the pain points and which are the sort of areas where first meeting to a deployment can be the fastest. And some of these, rank ordering them, and if you can solve for the ones that are more burning problems than less, it's always sort of easier.
Why don't we actually have Larry go next? Because I want to make sure you're not always the last one speaking on a topic.
It's okay. So I think that, and I think this is going more towards the operators of businesses relying on analytics versus the service providers. One of the things that we're seeing, and we just published a survey about this, is this massive imbalance in talent. That, despite having the positive intent on sort of building these great analytical tools and getting the most out of data, a lot of the companies that we are working with haven't really gotten the formula right on how to best deploy those analytic teams, whether, it's an organizational shift, and it's one that kind of cuts across, sort of the whole DNA of a company, where how you decide to organize around or not around analytics will have a very direct impact on how well you are able to attract and retain the right talent to enable you to get to the next level. We're finding that most of our larger companies, finding, retaining, attracting, and sort of holding on to great analytic talent is becoming a big problem, and it's not just the data scientists. There's a number of different skills that are in dire shortage now, for which going offshore is not always the best solution. So I think also getting smart about how to better deploy human capital against some of these challenges. It's one other area that you should think about or at least consider.
Matt?
So in terms of where the action is, I think it's sort of more or less saying the same thing, but I think of a slightly different vision of the timing. So indeed, the action right now is at the infrastructure level and the analytics level, and the next wave after that is clearly going to be at the application level. At the same time, if I were going to start a company right now, the infrastructure level is getting pretty crowded. I find, how many new, NoSQL or new SQL databases can you get and can you build? The analytics space is getting pretty crowded as well. How many new sort of social intelligence companies can you build as well? The application space is pretty much blue ocean at this stage, and if you're going to start a company now, big data is very much a proprietary technology or pure technology play. So you should focus on solving really hard problems, and for that you're going to need to develop very complex technology that's going to take you 2 years anyway. I think if I were going to start something now, I would actually probably focus on applications, whether those are pure sort of enterprise applications, so marketing, HR, sales, or sort of consumer applications. But on the enterprise side, there's plenty of things to be done. An example that I've heard a couple of times is CRM applications that would be not only mining internal data, which is sort of small data, even in large companies, but also combining it with external data sets and trying to extract unique insights from being able to do that.
So I get the last word?
Yes.
I have two practical pieces of advice. The first is, so many big data companies go in and say to the big company, if I can just get access to your data, I will show you how wonderful my product is. By saying that, you have just added 6 months to your sales cycle, at least, right? So figure out a way to show your product without their data. That's number one. And number two, if you get to if you have the meeting, they like what you're doing, they send you an NDA, don't hire a lawyer. Sign the NDA and move on.
Good advice. So, questions from the audience? Yeah, right there.
Follow up on medical science and research. You gave this wonderful example that that's where big breakthroughs are expected. There were big breakthroughs due to what used to be big data in the past, medical imaging, for instance. Could you name in financial industry the equivalent of the revolution caused by medical imaging?
I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but all the risk models and the way they've been developed is just as sophisticated and as dependent on data and analytics as any other vertical would be. So I've always found the risk fraud type of areas to be really, really advanced in the financial services side.
I would say electronic trading. That's it. I mean, because if you look at and New York was sort of a hotbed of this in the early, kind of in the mid to late 90s, the move from sort of floor trading to electronic exchanges in any number of areas was a very disruptive, and that was less of a sort of big data thing, but it was sort of a move. It was a technology sort of intervention, if you will.
It was big data then.
Any other questions? Yeah.
A question about, it's almost a precursor to the big data aspect and financial services. I think for a place like Citi, I've never worked for a Citi, but I'll assume that there are a lot of legacy systems out there.
You are correct.
I think that it's proportionally size squared, I think. Is it fair to say that, given we're in the infrastructure phase, that in some ways we're almost in the pre-infrastructure phase where, you want the big data set, but even getting at that sort of single version of the truth, and it sort of gets back to right to the point, is finding ways to not only integrate these legacy systems, but, typically there's a lot of politics involved in getting to shut these things down. So you can have a great way to do this going forward, but I found it's a bit of a balancing act usually, keeping these things going, but having them feed into sort of something that's a little more modern and advanced. Are there any comments on that?
I'll you're absolutely right. I mean, legacy is one of the key reasons why we are slow. When you're starting out today as a web company, you can design your data structures and your data stack as you'd like it to be with the latest and greatest. That's not the case with a 200-year-old financial institution, right? So there certainly is legacy. So it's a balancing act. When I sort of I was just talking to some of my business partners the other day. Their ask was workflow management. I mean, their ask was, look, I am able to do a lot of good things with what we have today. The problem is I have no way of actually sharing that with anybody else. So do something tremendously amazing with the data, come up with a view, come up with an analysis, and then out comes a visualization, some sort of a graph or whatever it is, and it's a static sort of picturization of that insight that nobody can do anything with, right? If you walk into a meeting with that insight and somehow the discussion goes another direction, you just have no way of quickly answering and being relevant in that discussion. So being able to even annotate analyses that a team does, pick up where somebody else left. These are even things that are not possible today. So, there is a balancing act here, making things possible and easy in what is existing today, while you're sort of building for the next phase. I think both of those activities will always exist and continue in parallel, and we are sort of in the middle of both.
Irene?
Yeah, and if you look beyond our borders and you look at what some other big institutions have been able to do in that regard, and this innovation comes out of some of the more interesting places, Spain for banking or Brazil for banking. I remember being in Brazil maybe 12 years ago and being amazed at how advanced their core banking processes were, and I kept asking myself, why would Brazil have developed such advanced systems of transaction processing, almost near real time back in the day? And well, it's because of hyperinflation, and if they didn't evolve, well, then they were going to lose massive amounts of capital for every second that they delayed a transaction being cleared. Spain has great case studies in large banks that have developed this sort of single views of household and customers while having legacy systems. I mean, so it's not as though it's impossible. I think part of it is also sort of investing after the right vision and knowing that it's going to take some time.
Last question from the audience. We all want to still make cocktail. Yeah.
Sorry, can't hear you.
Can you speak up or move towards the front?
So I think your question is, because of the regulatory environment, how do we see sort of the chief risk officers and the risk groups better leveraging big data? That's very consistent with what we've been talking about in terms of risk and fraud. From a regulatory compliance, there is no choice but to comply with sort of the letter of the law, and there's programs across the board dealing with that, not all of which are really kind of in the big data space, if you will, but all of which are having to utilize massive amounts of data. I was in fact in one of my Wall Street clients today, and we were talking about their daily reconciliation process. They have to overnight now. They're using something like 50,000 processors already in some distributed high-tech, high-speed computing environment, and they're still taking, multiple hours in crunching their portfolios to get sort of the regulatory capital, requirements on a daily basis, And that's a massive improvement from where they were, say, 3 or 5 years ago, but still, far away from being able to do it intraday or real time, which is where some of these banks want to go to. So I don't think there's a choice in the matter, and I think from a banking perspective, the job is really in the risk group to get fraud and to get regulatory capital and to get sort of all of these other big domains in order, and it's happening.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Larry said. The compliance and risk folks are at the table. So there is, there are just as much as the IT and data scientists are, so is somebody from the chief information security side or things like that. So very much at the table. It's the first. It is part of the. It's a holistic discussion. You just can't have a discussion with the user group, the analysts, and the data scientists without bringing the right folks from the compliance side into the mix as well. So it happens from the very beginning in some of these big banks, for sure.
So I want to thank all the panelists for their time tonight, and a round of applause for their great insights.